Welcome back, fellow programmers, to our beginner-friendly TypeScript series. In today's video, we'll delve into an essential topic that every developer should master: working with promises and asynchronous programming in TypeScript. TypeScript, being a superset of JavaScript, offers excellent support for asynchronous programming through promises. A promise is an object that represents the eventual completion or failure of an asynchronous operation, returning a value once resolved. It simplifies writing clean, readable, and error-handling code when working with asynchronous tasks. Let's now jump into some practical examples to see how promises work in TypeScript. Imagine we have a function that fetches data from an API asynchronously. We can use the fetch function, which returns a promise, to achieve this. Fetching data with a promise. In this example, we define a fetch data function that takes a URL parameter. Within the function, we create a new promise that wraps the fetch function. The promise's executor function receives two arguments, resolve and reject, which we can use to handle the asynchronous operation's outcome. Inside the promise's executor, we call the fetch function with the provided URL. We use the then method to handle the resolved promise, where we check if the response is successful, with a 200 status code, and resolve the promise with the response's text content using response.text. If the response is not successful, we reject the promise with an error. Additionally, we use the catch method to handle any errors that may occur during the fetch operation or promise handling. Finally, we invoke the fetch data function with the desired URL and chain the then and catch methods to handle the resolved promise and any potential errors that may occur. Now, promises have two possible outcomes. They can be either resolved or rejected. When resolved, the promise returns the value we expect. When rejected, it handles errors gracefully. To handle these outcomes, we use the then and catch methods, respectively. In this example, we're using the then method to handle the resolved promise. Here, we can access the fetched data and perform any necessary operations. On the other hand, the catch method allows us to gracefully handle errors and perform error-specific actions. Promises also provide a powerful feature called chaining, allowing us to perform multiple asynchronous operations in sequence. This is achieved using the then method, which returns a new promise. In this example, we're fetching data from one API, then using the retrieved data to fetch additional data from another API. By chaining promises together, we can ensure that each operation completes before moving on to the next. Another handy feature is the ability to handle multiple promises simultaneously using promise all. This method accepts an array of promises and returns a new promise that resolves when all the provided promises have resolved. Handling multiple promises with promise.all. In this example, we have a fetch data function similar to the previous example that fetches data from a URL using promises. We define an array URLs that contains the URLs from which we want to fetch data. We then create an empty array promises to store the promises generated by fetch data. Next, we iterate over each URL in the URLs array using the forEach method. Inside the loop, we push a new promise returned by fetch data passing the URL into the promises array. After that, we use promise.all and pass in the promises array. Promise.all takes an array of promises and returns a new promise that resolves when all the provided promises have resolved. This allows us to handle multiple promises simultaneously. In the then method, we receive an array of results that corresponds to the resolved promises in the order they were provided. We can then perform further actions with the results. If any of the promises in the promises array are rejected, the catch method will be triggered, allowing us to handle any errors that occurred during the promises. We covered the basics of promises, how to handle resolved and rejected promises, chaining promises, and handling multiple promises using promise.all. In our next video, we'll explore async, await, a syntactic sugar on top of promises that allows us to write asynchronous code in a more synchronous style. It's a fantastic addition to TypeScript, making our code even more readable and maintainable. If you found this video helpful, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel to stay updated on all our beginner-friendly TypeScript tutorials. Also, Feel free to leave any questions or suggestions in the comments section below. We love hearing from you. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, happy coding!